were two distinguishing features that made a land animal clean under the law of Moses. This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Leviticus on walking through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Leviticus chapter 11. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 12. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Leviticus chapter 11, beginning at verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those that chew the cud, or those that have cloven hooves. The camel, because it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves, it is unclean to you. The rock hyrax, because it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The hare, because it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. And the swine, though it divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud, it is unclean to you. The flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you. These you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever in the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. But all in the seas or in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water of any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. They shall be an abomination to you. You shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. Whatever in the water does not have fins or scales, that shall be an abomination to you. With the beginning of chapter 11, going through the end of chapter 22, we now come to the third section of Leviticus. Section 1, which covered chapters 1 through 7, dealt with the sacrifices offered to God under the law of Moses. Section 2, which covered chapters 8 through 10, covered the priesthood under the law of Moses. Section 3, then, will cover regulations concerning uncleanness and its removal. If you recall from the discussion on the peace offerings in chapter 7, if you were unclean and ate of the meat sacrifice, you were to be cut off from among the people. Yet up until this point, what made a person clean or unclean had not really been discussed, only alluded to in chapters 5 and 7. Starting in chapter 11, God reveals to Israel what he meant by clean and unclean, with the first thing being talked about is animals, specifically in the first part, which was allowed to be eaten and which was not. Now we must make note that the description of these animals as clean or unclean does not have anything to do with the animal's hygiene or suitability for food, for there is no such distinction given under the law of Christ, but here it is solely based on God's choice for his people under this law. These dietary restrictions would separate his people from among the nations and cause them to stand out, which is what God wanted. What we're going to find is that food was divided into 5 classifications: animals, meaning land animals, fish, birds, insects, and creeping things. Of the land animals, there would be 2 distinguishing features, both of which an animal must have in order for it to be considered clean. It must chew the cud, and it must divide the hoof. Chewing the cud is when an animal regurgitates its food and rechews it as part of the digestion process, while a divided hoof or a cloven hoof is a hoof that is split into 2 toes. If it didn't have either of these features, then it was unclean, and if it only had one of these features, it was also unclean. Now, with some animals, it would be easy to determine if it was unclean, while with other animals, it might be more difficult. So God gave some examples as a means of clarification. The camel chews the cud, but it doesn't have a completely cloven hoof, so it is unclean. The rock hyrax chews the cud, but doesn't have cloven hooves, so it is unclean. We should note here that this animal doesn't actually chew the cud, but it looks like it does, so that's why God, through Moses, included it. This shows us that the rule for chewing the cud was not necessarily one of scientific accuracy, but as a means of knowing which animals were clean. Thus, if it looked like it chewed the cud, it was constantly chewing, then it chewed the cud. The Hebrew thus didn't need to be a scientist in order to obey God. The same would be true of the hare. It chews the cud, or it looks like it does, but doesn't have cloven hooves, so it is unclean. On the other side, swine do not chew the cud, although they have cloven hooves, or at least look like they do, but since they don't have both characteristics, they are also unclean. These animals were not only unclean to eat, but even the dead carcass of these animals were unclean. That is why when Jesus cast the demons into the swine, as we saw in our studies of Matthew and Mark thus far, part of the reason for doing so undoubtedly was to teach those who were raising these animals that they shouldn't have been doing so. If you ate these animals or touched their dead carcass, you would be unclean according to the law. So a sampling of clean animals would be deer, goats, sheep, and cows, while unclean animals would be pigs and horses and donkeys. As you can see, clean or unclean meats had nothing to do with animal hygiene or the suitability for food, but simply on those two characteristics, chewing the cud and parting the hoof. When it came to animals that swam in the sea, another characteristic was given. The animal must have fins and scales. If it did not have both, it was unclean and not to be eaten, nor the dead carcasses touched. That meant that under the law, a sampling of seafood that would be considered clean would be bass, flounder, haddock, halibut, pollock, and tuna, while seafood that would be unclean would be catfish, crab, eel, mussels, oysters, lobsters, shrimp, swordfish, and whale. Now you might think that these types of restrictions were harsh, but God is a holy God and desires that his people be holy as well. Whatever he considered clean and unclean therefore needed to be followed if one was to be accepted. In truth, the Israelite had plenty of good food to eat, even with those unclean foods being identified. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Leviticus chapter 11, verses 13 to 23, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.